I'd like to share the story of a woman who came to a Designing Your Life for Women retreat about a year and a half ago. So one of the things that she had been for a long time thinking about was how to have impact in her community. She cares deeply about the area in which she lives. She lives in Carlsbad County in Southern California and was really feeling the need to serve her community better. And in her 3 Odyssey plans, one of them included running for office. And when she shared those plans with her colleagues at the retreat, she was lit up. She was excited. She cared deeply about the work she was doing, and she was fired up. And they noticed that, and they reflected that back to her. And afterward, we debriefed the whole experience. And she said, yes, the other women in my triad, they mentioned that I was really fired up about this. And we asked her, what's stopping you? And she said, well, frankly, the fundraising aspect. I have lots of ideas about policy. I really believe that our community can be well served by doing some particular things. But the idea of raising money for a campaign feels very daunting. And in that moment, another woman got up and handed her $5 and said, let me be the first to contribute to your campaign. And so Lena Panagaitis is now running for office in Carlsbad County. And there was this moment where she realized that she could do this, and she's now doing it. And I think that's the power of radical collaboration and the process of unearthing where you're fired up, where you want to serve your community, and then having people around you affirm you in doing those things.
Hi. My name is Eran Dror, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them.
Today I'm talking to Kathy Davies. Kathy wears many hats. She's a design lecturer at Stanford University and managing director at the Stanford Life Design Lab. She and her team have trained 150 universities globally to use the life design process on campuses to help students design, prototype, and test the right career paths for them. She's also a co-founder and CEO at DYL Consulting, that's Design Your Life Consulting, where she uses design thinking and life design principles to build a better world. In her previous life, Kathy was also an engineer in Silicon Valley, focused on transformative tech like Internet of Things and medical devices. So let's jump right in with Kathy Davies.
So I'm sitting across the screen from Kathy Davies. Kathy, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so I guess the first question before I go into the more podcasty thing is to ask, how are you doing these days? What's the situation where you are? How are you processing what's going on?
Yeah. I think that's the first question that's on all of our minds these days. I'm doing all right. A friend of mine says, I can't complain, but I really want to. And I think that's a perfect answer. I'm here in the Bay Area. Right now is an interesting time because we have the collision of the pandemic and also the fires that are now under much better control, but continue to burn and continue to affect the air quality. So not only are we inside and physically distanced from folks due to the COVID situation, but we also now really can't go outside very easily because the air quality is quite poor. So that for me, as someone who really gets a lot of energy from going outside and taking hikes and being in nature, has actually been strangely almost more difficult than COVID itself in some ways. Obviously, less broad reaching, but certainly just on a local level has a high impact. So we're hanging in there. I've got 2 daughters, 14 and 12, who are home doing school upstairs. And my partner is also a high school teacher. So he's upstairs doing teaching. And so we're very fortunate that we have the ability to do that and that we have a place that's at least at this time safe. And so I keep reminding myself of that.
And the bandwidth, which must be
We had to upgrade.
Yeah.
And I'm very fortunate that I was able to do that, because that's not available everywhere, and not everyone is financially able to do that. So I do count that as a blessing for sure.
For sure. I now have 2 separate internet connections at home, just like a DSL and a cable, just so that I can never lose connection to the outside world.
Yeah.
So it's good to hear that you can't complain, but you'd like to. I think this is the better part of the scope of this. But the fires, I'm trying to understand, because I've read a little bit about the fires in California, but does it actually affect life where you live, where you can't go outside to nature, or what's the?
Yes, absolutely. So the fires, there were 12,000 lightning strikes several weekends back that started all of these fires. That hit ground. So what that meant was multiple small fires started in a wide variety of places around the Bay Area. But the 3 main fires were the CZU fire, which is burned through sort of Santa Cruz Mountains, the LNU fire, the largest fire and the most destructive, and that's north of where we are, up in the Vallejo, Vacaville, north of the Bay Area, and then the CSU fire, which is east. And that has burned over 300,000 acres of wilderness, almost directly east and south of us. So the CSU fire initially was the fire that I think was affecting our air quality here in Fremont most strongly initially. But the LNU fire also, because the winds tend to blow south, also affected our air quality quite a lot. And just the loss of structures in life. I mean, the 1,500 structures in the LNU, I believe, and a similar number in the CZU. So quite a lot of certainly livestock and animals, and also just property destruction and a few folks, but I think for the most part, people were able to evacuate.
Wow. Okay. Well, I actually didn't realize it was that bad.
300,000 acres, and right. It was a really unusual situation. So the dry lightning strikes, very rare. We don't have that very often here, and certainly in those numbers, no. It was startling. We were awakened because it happened in the late night, early morning. We were awakened by the sound of the thunder. It was wow. quite amazing, actually, in terms of just the power of nature.
Wow, what a year this is!
We have been joking in the Bay Area that the next thing is probably locusts.
Yeah, exactly. We got 2 down. So, wow. Hopefully everything is is going to be under control soon, and at some point the rains will also probably help with this. Yeah. Holding my fingers crossed.
Thank you.
Now, in terms of the corona, I think that has a more, maybe a deeper effect on work, right?
Indeed.
And indeed. So, if you could, before we kind of dive into the chronology and all that stuff, if you could just maybe tell us a little bit about, how do you think of what you do today? And then how do you think about the way it's changing now and the challenges involved?
Oh, that's a big question. I typically teach classes at Stanford in a room, typically between 50 and 100 students. And it's a highly interactive in-person experience. And we move around a lot, stand up, sit down, move our chairs, do things on the wall, because ideating standing up is a great way to just get the creative juices flowing. Mm. And I work with a team, and we spend a lot of time together, physically together, working on our curriculum, and then, of course, delivering classes together. And in addition, Susan and I deliver workshops in the world for DYL Consulting, specifically workshops for women, and also intensive workshops for co-ed groups and for companies. And all of those also happen in person and are highly hands-on. So the experience of locking down was a really big change for what I do, because what we do is so interactive and had so much been about really the people
Right.
And so the challenge then was, can we do this virtually? And to be honest, I wasn't sure that we could. My colleagues, I think, were much more optimistic than I at Stanford. And I'm so grateful to them, because we had to make the transition in a matter of weeks, as did all the educators in the world who were trying to serve students ages K through, whatever
Right.
age they're working with, adult learners. So now we're doing it like this, like you and I are talking, and it has been actually remarkably successful, which I wouldn't have predicted. I think the thing that has happened now is we are really thinking pedagogically about how to vary energy, not by changing body position, but by changing activity, by having individual learners be able to do some assessment or some reflection quietly off screen. So actually writing with, pen and paper, old school, and then talking in pairs in breakout rooms and in small groups in breakout rooms, and then leveraging some of the technology. Chat in particular has been great, because what that allows people to do is everyone can contribute. And in an in-person classroom, you call on 1 or 2 or 3 people and then you move on. But in the chat, everyone can share their thoughts and everyone can read everyone else's thoughts. And so that's actually been a tremendous gift to the work we do. So in some ways it's better, right? And that's been a big learning for us is just, okay, how can we, now if we go back into the in-person space, which I'm excited to do, how can we gather that same kind of full group participation? And what would that look like to mash it up, or even to use something like chat when we're together? And so I think it's opened up a whole new space of opportunity, quite frankly, while at the same time being a bit of a process of grieving that we can't be together. So kind of a mixed bag, I guess.
It feels like that to me as well. I feel like we can solve relatively easily for the productive stuff. Like we actually can get things done online. But what's missing for me still, and I think really requires a lot of thinking and creativity and design, is to bring the fun of a real in-person event, because that's the hardest thing. And even in this conversation, if we were having it in real life with a glass of beer, or, that would have felt very differently than like a little square on the screen. And I have to have my notes on the screen as well. So it's even smaller. But it was interesting what you said. So many thoughts about what you said, but so you said by varying the activities, you introduce the energy. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Pedagogically, we are terrible. Students are terrible. And by really definition, humans have gotten, I think, quite a bit worse in the last 50 years as technology has empowered a lot of code switching and a lot of multitasking. We're getting a lot worse at paying attention. And so what that means is if I decide as a lecturer, I'm going to just tell you everything I know for a long time, what will happen is for the first few minutes, you're kind of engaged and you're nodding along. And then your attention starts to drift. And then, especially since we're on screen, you might notice, I had got a new email. Right. And because we're just here on screen, you're like, click, click, click. I'm just going to just change windows for a second. I'm still listening.
Especially if it's a multi-party meeting where I'm not being, at the center of it.
Exactly. If it's a multi-party meeting where you're not actively contributing, your thought is, well, this isn't hurting anyone. And I'm just being a little bit more productive. And in one way that's true, because you did answer that email and that's off your plate. And for a lot of us, too much email is a problem. But you also then aren't as engaged in the material, and probably you won't remember some of the things that happened during that time that you were writing an email, because in fact, our brains don't do 2 things at once. We actually switch between tasks. And so that means at the time that you were actively writing, you were not actually present. And so in our curriculum design, we think a lot about, okay, you get about 5 minutes to talk. And then we've got to say, okay, try something yourself right now. Get out your pen, get out your paper, build this thing, whatever it is. Think about this topic, jot down some thoughts. All right, now we're putting you in pairs. And if you're in a pair, there's nowhere to go, right? You have to actually interact with the person. And then those pairs go into groups of 6, and there's more sharing of insights, and then to the full group and then the full chat. So it's actually a quite a consistent progression that we're tending to use in our classes now. And each of those spans of time is relatively short. And certainly the part where we're just talking is relatively short, because we know everyone's attention wanders, especially on screen.
Yeah, interesting. That really makes me want to try some things. But I think it's definitely interesting to think about how to bring the stuff that works from the webinars into real life. I've done something like this that worked really well. I had this was before even Corona, but I brought WhatsApp into like a big event. There were like 150 people in the audience, and I had the barcode on the screen. And I also send it in advance, but anybody who wants to contribute during the talk, scan the barcode. And WhatsApp is super, super popular here. So everybody just scans the barcode and they can participate. So I ask questions and kind of give exercises, and people write in chat. And it was phenomenal. Great. People were writing, it was like hundreds of messages, and it was funny and it was engaging. And so that's definitely, I think that's the future of live events too, is that we're definitely going to bring some more of that.
Yeah. There's been a bunch of research at Stanford, and one of my colleagues, we spent a fair amount of time talking about pedagogy. And one of my colleagues said the measure of how a student feels about an event or about a class, and in a way, classes are events at this point, is how much they feel heard.
Yeah.
And so, and you think about that, right? Here in the time of COVID, we have the interactions that we have within our own physical structures, and perhaps we have a pod of people that we interact with. But what we've lost is all of the incidental interaction.
Yeah.
We're no longer standing in the coffee line and noticing somebody's shoes, or chatting with the barista, or having that just brush past of somebody that we didn't expect to see on campus or in our office. The, hey, how was your weekend, with the person that we don't know well. And as a result, all of those loose ties that are so critical in our thriving are missing.
Yeah.
And that just leads to a feeling of being unseen. And so if we can, in our events, in our classes, in just the interactions we have, give people more opportunities to be seen during this time and heard during this time, I think that's what we all need a little bit in our hearts. So we're thinking a lot about that, as in both at Stanford and also in the DYL Consulting world that Susan and I are working on.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that. That's so powerful. We all want to be heard and seen, and you know, when you even gesture at that, when you even just say, okay, I want to please write down your ideas for this, and then you just call out a couple people, right? But you let them participate. You know, it's great. Great. So I want to do now the kind of our traditional opening for a conversation, which is I try to connect, and you probably appreciate it because this is what you do, but I try to connect what you do with who you are as a person and have been. And so the question that I came up with to kind of start this discovery is to ask, what's something you've discovered or learned early in life or in childhood that is still present and still drives you today? And you can take your time because it's a big, big question. To see if you can find something that is kind of like has been there all these years. Yeah,
I have two things, I think, that come to mind. One of them is pretty light, and one of them is maybe a little bit, not darker, but a little bit more deeply connected to who I am. But the first one is, not too long ago, my parents were cleaning out their garage, and they gave me a raft of stuff that they had saved from my childhood. And so I've been going through this stuff. And one of the things that I found was one of those all about me books. that you write when you're a kid. And one of the questions, of course, is always, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the answer I had written, and I was about 7, I think. So I was in, first grade, second grade, something like that. What I wrote was, when I grow up, I will be an artist and a scientist. And I'm a product designer.
Which is exactly the meeting
that's
place.
what that is. So
Yeah.
I think that there was always this interest, the deep interest in art. And my whole family is in science. So my father is a geologist and physicist. My mother is an amateur botanist and just deeply engaged with the natural world. And my sister is a PhD in microbiology, and my brother is a geneticist. So like there's a pretty strong
Smart
science
family.
bent, in our family. My brother's now gone on to be a software engineer in addition to being a PhD in genetics. So, so this is a pretty sciencey crew, and so I'd say that is deeply embedded in how I think, just my problem-solving techniques. On the more personal side, I was also a very weird kid. I came from this family of scientists, and I wasn't very socially adept, to put it in the nicest possible way. And what that meant was there was a period of time where I really had very few friends. I went to a Montessori school when I was little, which was a work at your own pace school. It was an experimental school, and there were only 12 students. It grew a little bit, but there were no girls my age. And so there was a period of time where I really didn't have anyone who was an age peer and a gender peer. And I was also incredibly introverted and spent most of my time reading. So I didn't develop social skills either. I think my feeling was that somehow, like in some of these books, someone would just come and become my friend with no work on my part whatsoever. And then I went into public school, and I was academically advanced, but socially quite behind. And again, my friend-making skills consisted of sitting in a corner, reading. So that really was 0. And as a result, people made fun of me a lot because I was very odd. And I was also very competitive. So not only was I odd, but I was like in your face odd. I wasn't a fly under the radar odd.
Okay. Some of my best friends.
And so I share that because I think that as a result, I was reflecting on this actually quite recently, because of that, I think that there's a lot of understanding or empathy for sort of the folks who are maybe a little more on the margins, and also a deep-seated desire to be part of community and to be doing work in community. Because there was a period of time where I was very lonely, where I felt like, and in COVID, this is what was making me reflect on it, just this idea of loneliness or being separated from community, and recognizing it from my youth and feeling this is part of what I'm about, is connecting people in community to have these kinds of conversations that can help them to both make decisions in their lives, to build together things that they think need doing in the world, to have impact, and also just to be healthy and happy and thriving in and of themselves. Because I think that's something that I really need.
That's really interesting. So there's this aspect of connecting to other people. That's a big part of your job now, and helping them feel like they're connected to the world through their work and through the decisions they make, and in a way, it's the good kind of fitting in, because it's the fitting in that comes from inside, that comes from like, okay, what do I want? What are my values? And then going and finding that place in the world, right? So that must be very satisfying.
That really brought to mind this idea of radical collaboration, right? It's the good kind of fitting in. It's the kind of getting together with others, sharing ideas that you're all interested in, and then doing something about something that matters to you all. And I do think that that's the only way forward.
Yeah.
I don't think we can get out of some of the problems that we have built as a world without folks really working together across difference.
Yeah. And when you're, I was also a kind of a weird kid, and that's good. Like that's in the world of finding your passion and finding your work. The fact that you're interested in things that are not, every day or not everybody shares is a good thing. It's a clue. It helps you find your kind of people and your kind of work. So it's definitely, I remember to share a personal story. So my father told me he was very young. He came to pick me up from kindergarten and I was like red and crying, and like apparently what happened was I was fighting with all the other kids because I told them about there used to be this big hairy elephant called a mammoth, and they didn't believe me and they laughed at me and they thought I was crazy, and I was like, no, there is. My dad told me. And but then there used to be, like, I was right.
Right.
And
You're right.
And you find you find out that not always fitting in is actually, or not fitting in every situation, and not kind of suppressing what you know and what you feel in order to fit in is a good thing overall and over time.
Yeah. And then as a parent, I'm raising two wonderful daughters, and sometimes you notice that the apple hasn't fallen far from the tree. So my one daughter, this was when she was in about first grade or second grade, we were having a discussion about Disney movies, and she said, "Mom, don't you love Snow White?" And I said, "Well, no, not really. I think Snow White wasn't all that smart. They said, don't open the door. She opened it 3 different times. It's clear that the witch was after her. Then there's the weird part about the prince kissing the dead princess. Like, there's just a lot of things about that movie that concern me." So a couple weeks later, I get a call from another mom in the school. And she said, I need to talk to you about Laurel. And I said, "Oh, well, what's going on?" She said, "Well, she really made my daughter feel bad." And I said, "Oh, no, what's happened?" She said, "Well, my daughter really likes Snow White. And your daughter said Snow White was stupid and then went off on a whole tangent. And that Snow White made a lot of bad decisions."
That's really funny. And
I didn't quite know what to say, because obviously it was not good that my daughter had made her daughter feel bad. And I obviously agreed that Snow White didn't make good decisions. And it was this funny moment of having to have a conversation with my daughter about the difference between being right and being kind, and how those aren't always the same thing. And yeah, and I frankly, I still struggle with that. I'll get into arguments with people and I'll realize this argument isn't worth it. I could be right, or I might not be right, but the damage to the relationship probably isn't worth either of those results.
Yeah.
But I think that's difficult to explain or to even understand when you're a kid. And certainly I did not understand that when I was a kid. That was part of my weirdness, was I was willing to wade into every argument with like guns blazing. Yeah. I would have fought to the death about the mammoth, just like you.
Yeah. I was the same for most of my young life, but definitely the first part of my life. It's really interesting. I have so many things. I just wanted to throw out there that, like, this core principle in Buddhism that really affected me is like the idea of right speech. And right speech is not necessarily true speech, because it has 2 criteria. It has to be true and useful, beneficial. Right. So if you can cause a lot of damage with the truth in the wrong moment, right? And so just thinking, is this actually useful to say it right now? And it's definitely something that I strive for, but am often falling short. And when something is clearly true, but like it's not necessarily the smart thing to say.
Thank you for that. I actually really like that framing, and I think it's one that would benefit me also. Thank you.
Thank you for triggering the thought. So continue on from there. So you're a young person who wants to be an artist and a scientist, and has very strong views on things. And so do you start with engineering? Do you first gravitate towards engineering?
Yes. And funny story, I went to Brown as an undergrad, and the way it works at Brown, you have to choose or at that time, this is back in the day, so I don't know if this is still true, but back in the day, you had to choose sort of a core class that you were going to take as your grounding class as a freshman. And engineers were required to take, or are told to take an engineering core class. And I chose to take an art class instead, nice. Which then resulted in sort of jacking up my schedule. But I did join the engineering core as well in order to not close that option. And then so I really enjoyed the art class, but then the engineering requirements were so large that I ended up moving in that direction, mainly because I didn't want to give it up. I hadn't really chosen into it in wanting to give up art, but I was afraid to give up engineering, and I was good at it, and I liked it. And so I continued through my 4 years. Although I will say that at the end of my freshman year, there was a moment where in a fit of like, I'm not going to do this anymore, I sold back my engineering 3 textbook to the bookstore, in a raging against the machine. But I did stick it out and ended up getting my degree in biomedical engineering with an emphasis in biomechanics. And but then later got more interested in this intersection between biology and engineering.
Wow, that's really interesting. And engineering is also a kind of, it has a component of creativity, and it has a component of science. Mm-hmm. It might be a little bit more closer to science than to art, but it has both in a way that a designer does. And you seem to have done a lot of really interesting projects in the engineering part of your life. What's something that's kind of super memorable or super meaningful to you in that period?
Oh, golly. I think memorable, probably we had a project that was about evacuating poor odors from the toilet tank, which was codenamed the fart fan.
Awesome.
Well, I also worked on an internet appliance. Before everything could be done on your laptop, there was a short period where folks were building these internet appliances that would go into your home and wouldn't require a computer. And one of the early ones was an internet radio. And I worked with this startup called Kerbango as a consultant. And wow. I didn't even start as an engineer. I spent a couple years, and this is, I think, connected to where I am now. I spent a couple years right after college teaching high school physics because I didn't know what I wanted to do.
That's awesome.
And somebody said, oh, they always hire women science teachers. And so I did that. And that, I think, informs the arc 25 years later. Now here I am again in the classroom. And so obviously there's something about that process of teaching or interacting with other learners that I like, and that somehow is fulfilling. I think it connects to the community bit. Now that I hear myself say that, I think it is the doing things in community.
Yeah, it involves people. So, how did you first get involved with design thinking? I'm assuming it wasn't straight into life design. It
no.
started with okay.
So. Yeah, I didn't go straight into life design. So I spent 4 years in undergrad. Then I spent 2 years teaching high school physics at a boarding school on the East Coast. And at that point in time, I had, I think, at least the wisdom to recognize that I wasn't doing that as well as I would like. And part of the reason was I couldn't yet separate what was mine to control and what was the students to control. So, and by that, I mean, I would teach a class, I'd think, wow, that was the greatest class. And then some students would be distracted and they wouldn't do the homework. And then I'd feel like, oh, maybe that was something wrong with what I did, and not giving them the agency that actually, whether they chose to do the homework or not, that's really their choice. And that may have to do with whether I did a good job, or that may have to do with the fact that there's a dance coming up and they're more interested in talking to their friends about that. And also recognizing that, in fact, some of the students were going to really resonate with me and some of them weren't going to. And I could continue to work on becoming a better teacher, but that was going to take time. So I got a little bit, I don't know if disillusioned is the right word, but I decided that I was going to try something else. And so I had, in the time that I was at Brown, met some folks who were product designers. They had a product design firm in Rhode Island and in Providence. And I had gone and tried to get a job there. That's a whole nother story about how poorly I interviewed. It was disastrous. At one point I was, yeah. Oh, it's a great story. But the seed was planted at that time that product design was a thing and that it was something that I might be interested in. And it was this fusion of engineering and art. And so the folks who had run that had mentioned the Stanford product design program, actually in a pretty, like, that's a program, but that's not what you should do kind of way. You should go to a real art school if you really want to learn design. But something about that really appealed to me because I didn't have the art training and I didn't think I could get into art school. I thought, well, gee, this guy mentioned that wasn't a real design program, but it was an engineering program and I could potentially fit there. So I did some research. I decided that in order to get in, I was going to need better art stuff. So I took a bunch of classes at the high school where I was teaching. I asked the other teachers if I could sit in, which I think they found really weird, but I thought it was fabulous.
Yeah.
And then I created a portfolio, which, such as it was, of things that I had done, both engineering and art, and I sent it off. And then I got into the product design program at Stanford. And I would say that's where truly my engagement with design as I teach it and as I use it today professionally started. So the design thinking process, the process of really getting in the shop and building things. I was later a TA in the machine shop. All of that stuff formed during those years of graduate school, I would say.
Wow. And it seems like Stanford is really the center of this whole design thinking movement. And were you there with, because that's where it all comes from the design school. Were you there with David Kelly and with IDEO folks? And
I was, and I actually spent a summer and then the following school year working at IDEO as an intern, and did spend time with David Kelly. There were a panel of professors who I received critique from, and David was one of them. Wow. As was Matt Kahn, an amazing art professor we had, and Bill Burnett, now the executive director of the product design program. And a man named Rolf Fasty, who has since passed away, who was at that time the executive director of the program. And so those four guys, and another guy, Michael Berry, also would come and give us a lot of critique. And so that panel of folks was really formative in my experience as becoming a designer.
Well, so now is the time maybe to ask you what is that? Because I find a lot of people use design thinking as kind of a buzzword.
I agree.
that they don't really understand. Yeah. And I feel like I find myself at odds. Actually, the more almost the person talks about design thinking, sometimes it feels like the less they actually understand it. Mm-hmm. And people who, at least in my environment, and it seems to me that most of the people who actually do get it are from California. So is it, how would you define design thinking given this experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say, well, first of all, I think design thinking is often misapplied. It's not the solution to every problem, unlike maybe the popular meme. Let's do design thinking. Design thinking at its core is human-centered design, and human-centered design has been around a long time. So Stanford didn't invent this process. Stanford didn't invent the idea of designing for people and keeping people at the center of design. Right. Stanford did do a really nice job of marketing, frankly, the design thinking process. Yeah, and creating these hexagons that are very memorable. And so just a nice mnemonic about what it is, a nice visual mnemonic. But it really is this process of putting the user first and trying to understand the user well. Mm. And so the steps, as you've probably heard them, are empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And when people picture it, I think they really picture ideate, right? They picture the thousands of colorful Post-its,
Right.
right? The exuberant brainstorm with candy, which is part of the process. But really, it's the first two steps that I think really matter. I'll say a little bit more about that. Empathizing and understanding the people that you're designing for, and frankly, designing with, is the way that I am starting to think more about it. Because at the end of the day, the folks that are in need of whatever this product or service that you're thinking about building, those people, they know what they do now. They know what they actually need. They have core values that need to be served. And so inviting them into the design process is increasingly key, I think. And especially if you're working on big, wicked problems, things about justice, things about climate, things about people are deeply engaged, not only on a cognitive level, but on an emotional level with these kinds of big problems. And so if you aren't designing with those people, if you're just trying to design for them, save people or convince them, you're never going to get anywhere, because at the end of the day, we're talking about behavior change if we're talking about systemic change. So that first step, that empathize step, really getting in there with the folks, I think that's critical to good design.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Yeah. Yeah. And I imagine as a product designer, you know this, right? You've had, I'm sure, experiences where really having good conversations, shadowing, walking in the shoes of, talking with, inviting into the process have changed products that you've built.
Yeah, of course. I think one of the things I like to say is that the quality of conversation in the beginning determines the quality of the product. And I mean both the conversation with the end user, but also with the internal team, and being able to absorb many different points of views and not run away from them because they don't match your own. And that's why I'm so excited about sprints is they found a way to kind of structure the conversation in a way that as long as you follow the rules, it's kind of hard for it to go wrong. Because it relies less on the personal maturity of the participants and more on just a structured process to absorb a lot of points of views and then kind of vote on them in a way that's there's almost no room for ego or it's just not. You can try to bring it into it, but the process can't support it because we're on the clock and we have to do the next step. And so that's why I'm excited about it. And yeah, definitely, I think this co-creation and empathy is super, super important.
Yeah. And I think that's why having diverse perspectives in the room is so important, just as you said, because if we all have the same views, then whatever our underlying biases, our underlying constraints and assumptions are, we'll just self-reinforce. But if we have a variety of viewpoints, then there will be challenges that will come out in the wash in that sprint, in that process. Lots of points of view will be aired. And then in that voting process, in the process of dissecting what we've discussed, we will get to something that is unexpected and innovative because all those ideas were present.
Exactly. And we had a sprint recently where we had 4 dominant people, each with a completely different view of what the project even is, which is the hardest thing to kind of work out. And because we follow this process where we actually listen to everybody before we make any decisions, a lot of these tensions that could have continued for months got resolved because we aired everything out in the beginning and we got alignment in the beginning. And so that's super important. But there's also this aspect of prototyping, right? And testing. And
there is. And I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about, can we go back to define before we get there?
Sure. Yeah.
Because strangely, even after what we've just discussed, I still kind of think at this point, in my career, I'm realizing the define step is probably the most important. Because just as you said about what is this project even about, that discussion that you had, and then the crystallization of what are we working on, that piece to me is the piece that sets the trajectory for the rest of the process in a really powerful way. And if you frame the question this way versus that way, right? This way, now we're looking over here, and this way we're looking over here. And I think that moment of crystallizing around what is it we're trying to do? What problem are we trying to solve? How have we verbalized that problem? What is the language we're using? That moment then determines almost the rest of the outcomes.
Yeah.
Because, if you ask the question one way and then all of your ideas are sort of pushing in one direction, and that means that then the thing that you prototype will come out of that idea pool.
Yep.
We like to say that how you frame the question determines the solution space.
Yeah.
And so
that's a great way of formalizing, because it's hard to explain to people why is a single word in the definition of the project can matter so much. So this is actually the best way to describe it that I've heard, that the question defines the possibility, the solution space.
It really does. And the wording, just as you just said, I feel like that is something that I'm just beginning to get my head around, because in diverse rooms, different words mean different things. And culturally, different words mean different things. And depending on the language you're using, you might not even have the words for different things. So there is something about this definition process that is quite thorny and actually quite hard to do well. And at the same time, it is, in my mind, almost the most important step of all, assuming that you've done good empathy work and that you've gathered a lot of understanding and that you're working with the people who have the problem and all of those things, getting to the point where we know where we're headed, that we have a pointer for the next ideation step. It's tough, and yet it's critical. So and the wording part is, I'm not expressing that well, but I'm really resonating with that remark about why does one word matter? It does.
I understand that. I resonate with that so much. We have this workshop when we teach design sprints, and I have this example. I have this problem that I give to people, which is kind of a fake problem, but that we work together to do a sprint on it. And the problem is, I want some sort of digital solution to the rain. I want to be protected from the rain. And we interview an expert on rain and the problems associated with rain in daily life. And then we kind of come up with solution. And then we try to define the goal for this project. And one person writes, we need to solve the problem of wet clothes, after rain. Like, people should not be staying in wet clothes. And one person says, we should solve the problem of not losing umbrellas, we should, right? And then another person says, people should learn to love the rain and not be afraid of it. And those are completely different companies, completely different products, everything.
Right.
And so, I find that the way you phrase it is super, super important. And it's very kind of immediate to me, that it's like, no, you just look at a couple variations of the goal before you decide.
Right.
Can make an enormous difference.
And this is where I think the life design stuff comes in hard, because when we're stuck, we often frame problems in ways that are difficult for ourselves to solve. It's how can I get promoted? And, that question is about getting a particular position in our current company, and maybe there isn't one available. And now I'm just banging my head against the wall, and I'm mad at my boss who's not promoted me last time. And there's the whole, and if we ask the question that way, then we get one set of results. But if we ask the question, how can I become a leader in terms of our product strategy? which is what the promotion really means in my mind. But this is, now we're decoupling it from the badge or from some things I can't control what my boss is going to do, and moves it into an area that I could potentially take action. How can I start influencing people? How can I learn more about the product direction and start making recommendations? How can I gather data that would support my point of view? How can I present in meetings? How can I lead teams?
Right.
Now I could do some of that stuff regardless of promotion, and it's actionable by me. But we don't often frame it that way. We don't often step back and do the reframe that allows us to move forward. Instead, and maybe there's something kind of satisfying too about railing against the universe or about against our bosses or whatever the thing is, just from an emotional standpoint. But one of the things we talk about a lot in life design is what's actionable by you. Where can you spend your energy toward a result that you want to have? And a lot of that is in the framing.
Yeah. So the framing is the same thing, is the correct usage of language to open the right possibility space. It's like magic. That's like Harry Potter. If you say the right words.
That way.
But it's true.
There's a lot of wand waving that doesn't result in what you want too. I'll say, I've framed many a problem incorrectly and then had to realize that through the next steps, right? Through the ideation and prototyping, right? That prototyping piece is magical too, in that it exposes where you screwed up before. Right.
That's where you know whether you
great knowledge.
That's awesome. So you had some direct experience with product design and design thinking, and you're around all these great people. And then where does the transition to life design happen? And then I'll ask you to define what it even is, and ask you some hard questions. But
sure. So for me, I went to school as a product designer, and then I dove into product consulting. So I worked at IDEO, as I mentioned briefly, and then I worked at a company called D2M for, I want to say 7 or 8 years, before then working briefly at a medical device startup, and then at a big TV startup. And then right around the time of that startup's demise, which was unfortunate, but I learned a ton, and I actually don't regret any part of being part of that company. I had kids. And so I took some time there to have children, and I worked part-time. And during that time, I went to an event at Stanford that was celebrating product design as a program. So the program had been in existence for 50 years, and there was a celebration of product design as a thing. And during the intervening years, since I had been a student, they had built the D School back in the day when I was a student. That didn't exist. In fact, product design was sort of the redheaded stepchild of the ME department, who they sort of wanted to shove into the cupboard, like Harry Potter under the stairs by the Dursleys, like that guy or that program. No good. And sort of an embattled program of crazy artists who were somehow sneaking into the engineering department. But the things had changed. And so now the D School was huge. And in fact, the president of Stanford had at that point described the D School as one of the 3 crown jewels of the university. And so it was a completely different landscape. And so they had this big party, and they had, folks talk, and David Kelly gave a presentation, and Bill Burnett was there. And so these were folks that I knew from back when I had been a student, and also I'd interacted with them professionally in these design consulting jobs and startups and so forth. And as this was all unfolding and they were describing the huge expansion of the program, they mentioned that they were going to be teaching, 10 sections of ME 101 and all of these grand plans. And so afterward, in sort of the cocktail hour, I sidled up to Bill Burnett, and he was talking to somebody else. So I kind of was like, hey, and then I handed him my card, and I said, it sounds to me like you're going to need some more instructors. Call me. It was like a weird sliding of the business card as sort of, to trying not to interrupt.
Nice.
And so he did. He called me about a year later. He called me and he said, hey, you said you might be interested in teaching. Were you serious? And I said, yes. He said, great. You could do everything from just coming in and delivering a single lecture to running a whole class. What do you want to do? And because I'm not one to go in halfway, I said, I'll run a whole class. And so I then had the good fortune to team teach with Bill Burnett and another fella, Eli Woolery, who I absolutely adore, who works at Envision now, and also is still teaching. And the three of us team taught the product design capstone course for seniors, developing products and services. And it was fabulous. And I really enjoyed it. And after doing that for a year or two, I asked Bill, who was running the program, I said, I'm liking this enough that I think I'd like to do this more as a full-time thing and less as a side hustle. Because at that time I was working still full-time in software, but I was doing this teaching on the side. And so at that point is the moment of transition between product design and life design, because there wasn't a full-time position available as a product design lecturer. In fact, the product design program as a whole really relies on kind of the volunteerism of the community to run a lot of the classes. They have a lot of external lecturers. But Bill and Dave Evans, so Bill Burnett and Dave Evans, the authors of Designing Your Life, had created this little teaching lab. And they had fellows in this teaching lab. And typically this was grad students that they'd hired out of the product design program or out of the School of Ed. And he said, well, you don't have a PhD. You aren't going to be a tenure track professor here, but we do have this fellowship thing going on. And if you're really serious, maybe talk to Dave about life design. And so I did. And have you heard Dave Evans speak or met him?
I've heard Bill and Dave speak, but mostly through YouTube videos.
Even I think in a YouTube video, the sheer crackling energy of Dave Evans probably translates. He is a 6'5", supercharged human. He's just magnetic. And so I had lunch with him, and he was telling me about life design, and I was just hooked. And I thought to myself, this makes so much sense. I've been using this product design process, this design thinking process to make goods and services for 25 years. How could I have not thought of this as a process of human development? That's genius.
Yeah. It does make a ton of sense.
Yeah. And so at that moment I thought, well, then I should do this. And so then I went home and I convinced my partner it would be a great idea for me to make less than half of my salary and go and be a fellow at Stanford, don't you think? And he said, okay, 2 years. You had 2 years. I'm a high school teacher already. You're the breadwinner. 2 years. So I said, sure, 2 years. That's what we'll do. And that was in 2014.
So a little more than 2 years.
Thank goodness for my wonderful partner who's willing to allow me to do this work and to work together to support our family rather than saying, hey, we need you to go back into industry.
Teaching is so rewarding that I would think that if they raised the salaries, nobody would doing anything else, because so it's almost like there's a few jobs that, and this is not for, it's interesting because it's not necessarily glamorous, but it's so satisfying for everyone that my own teaching, but also so many friends who are teachers. There's something fundamentally humanly satisfying about this activity, to the point where investment bankers leave their jobs to do this, and people who are losing millions of dollars to do this. So it's super interesting. So I want to ask a couple of hard questions, as kind of a devil's advocate to really get to the bottom of life design. So, why do we need design tools to choose a career? Why can't we just pick something and go with it? Why is it, are we just designers using the tool we know and insisting that it's the right tool for everything? Why can't we just go to a psychologist and let them say, go do this?
Right. Take the test that says,
Right.
you should be a whatever. In fact, I took that test in high school. I got baker. I should be a baker, apparently. Maybe I should. I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think you could go to a psychologist. And if that worked for you, I think that would be great. And if you took a test and you really resonated with the answer, I think that would also be great. I think that where design thinking is really valuable is if you're stuck. So if you have tried those things and you aren't getting answers and you're feeling that, geez, I just don't know, then it's a really nice process to sneak up on your future. And I like it because it's about building your way forward. It's not the only way to solve this problem. And I think that's the flaw in design thinking as it's been sort of popularized is, we should use design thinking. In fact, design thinking is not the right tool if what you're trying to do is efficiently execute it. You've already decided what you're going to do and you just need to execute it. Design thinking, not the tool you need. Design thinking is about trying things, about innovating, about discovering the unknown, really working through ambiguous problems. And it's not for tame problems. If you've got a tame problem and you've got an equation that you can just apply and solve that problem, then by all means use that equation. Like don't fool around with brainstorming if what you need to do is figure out the length of the bridge and you know the tensile strengths of steel and you have got a bridge design that you could copy. That would be silly. Just do it. But sometimes, and if you, from a life design perspective, if you already know, hey, I think I want to become a doctor and the next step is to go to medical school, then by all means, if you're ready to do that, do it. The thing is, sometimes we have ideas about what something's going to be like that are wrong. So our process is, well, good, go to medical school. But before you do that, just talk to a couple of people who are in medical school and shadow a doctor for a day so that you're really clear on what it's going to be like and what the end result might feel like to you. And then now you can do that thing that you were going to do with more confidence.
Yeah.
You have exposed some of the parameters that you're going to be working in and have gathered a little bit more data through felt experience and through resonant conversations with people who are maybe doing the thing you want to do. And now you can charge forward with even greater zeal if that's what happens.
So it's the places of wicked problems and unknown situations, or dealing with the uncertainty of it.
Right.
So, I going through life in the beginning when I was 18, I thought I was sure, 100% sure, I wanted to write novels. 100% sure. And that didn't turn out to be when I started writing. And actually, after years of trying, realized I really don't like writing that much. I don't like writing fiction that much. And I meet more and more people who are in their 30s, 40s, or even later, who are still trying to find the next step or what's the right thing for them. Or so why is it so hard? Maybe you probably have a better insight into this than most people in the world.
Why is it so hard?
Why am I in my 40s? I'm 40. Trying to figure out, still trying to figure out whether to get a PhD or to double down on this company or to do something or write a book. I'm still thinking about. So
right.
What's the core of it?
There's no right answer, right? Unlike engineering, where you can solve the problem and then it stays solved, there is no right answer, and the conditions are always changing. And I think this is the reality that we're living in. First of all, the reality around us is changing all the time. Who could have predicted that I'd be talking to you from my garage?
Right.
And so even if I had decided, hey, the plan is for me to be a public speaker and to travel the world and do events, it wouldn't be happening right now. Even if I had picked that and had decided that was what I was going to do, the external conditions may be such that what you had in mind is impossible.
Right.
And so then we got to change course. And so we need a process to help us change course. And then why is it so hard? because change is hard. I mean, and there is no right answer. And furthermore, there might be multiple right answers, and that might be all simultaneously true. And holding simultaneous but contradictory truths is something that we as humans are not very good at.
That makes sense to me. Because I think it was a TED Talk, I'm trying to remember the name, but it was a woman who said the reason hard problems are so hard, or hard questions are so hard, is that they're both equally good, but they're just extremely different.
Ruth Chang. Yeah, Ruth Chang. We actually use a clip from her TED Talk about choices that are on a par. And her talk is called Hard Choices, I believe. And it is a beautiful talk. I recommend it very highly. And one of the things she says in it is, the question has to come from inside. Who do you want to become as you make, because there's no right answer. The choices are equally good. That's why it's a hard choice. If there was she does it beautifully. I will mangle it. But she says, if one choice was clearly better than the other, then you would just pick that thing and move on.
Right. That would be hard.
It would be obviously better.
Right.
And that's not the case. And so what I love about that is, it invites some internal reflection. It invites the idea of growth. Who am I growing into? So I think that's actually a beautiful thing. But it's also why it's difficult, because internal reflection and knowing ourselves is not something that we are trained to spend much time on, especially in the Western world. We are trained to be productive. What are you doing sitting around navel gazing? Come on, let's go, right?
Yep.
And so this idea of self-awareness, or taking time to slow down and actually understand our own internal landscape, I think that's only recently gained any traction at all. If somebody had said, try meditation or try some mindfulness practices, somebody said that to me 20 years ago, I would have laughed at them. Like, that's for like gurus and stuff.
Yeah. Thinking about that, in Thailand, it's common for, unfortunately, mostly young men, but it's common for young men to spend a couple of months in the monastery before choosing a path in life. And it's normal. You go, you volunteer, you ordain for a couple of months. It's a thing. You could become a monk and then unbecome a monk. And many Thai people say this is the moment where clarity came, because they actually spend time thinking about who they are, what they care about. So it's really interesting. So talk about the life design process for someone who doesn't know it. What does it look like? How do you start with it?
You start by doing some self-awareness work. So we don't have a monastery, so we can't actually give people the space in that way. But what our programs and classes do is give people some space and time and some tools to reflect on who they are and what they believe and what they're doing, and to try to connect those dots to create a compass for themselves. And then using that compass, come up with some various ideas, and in fact, multiple choices that they can put on paper to then evaluate using some criterion that they have themselves decided matter to them. And then to recognize that they don't have to go all in on any one of these, but that they can dip their toe a little bit to gain confidence and build their way forward. So at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is giving people tools to wayfind, to navigate using some kind of a North Star, some kind of understanding of self and understanding of community and their place in community and how they potentially want to have impact. And then some ways to generate paths forward as they come up against the inevitable roadblocks and new data.
Interesting. And so you talk a lot about, in the life design group lab, talk about mindset and bringing design mindsets to career planning. And so can you talk about that a little bit? Yeah.
Sure. So it all starts, I think, with curiosity, being open like you're a small child, to possibility. And that's easier said than done, because we're trained from a young age to stop being outlandish, to be realistic. But if you think back to when you were a kid, and I blithely wrote down, I'll be an artist and a scientist, and you perhaps wrote down, I'm going to be a novelist. We didn't have any concept of what those things were, but we had absolute confidence that we could do it, whatever it was. Right. And we were deeply curious about all the things. And if you follow your toddler around, right, they're putting rocks in their mouth and tasting things and touching things. And they're engaged in the world in such a way that they're open to possibility. I think that's where it has to start, is the setting down our past wounds and our history and all of the things as much as we can. And sometimes those things serve us. As I mentioned, I've got some childhood wounds that maybe inform my empathy, but, and there are systems around us that might potentially be working to block us actively. And we're, I think, having greater awareness in the US more than perhaps I wish were the case, that there are truly systems that are holding people back based on their identity. So there are a lot of factors here, but curiosity, the wonder of, hey, I wonder what's possible, is where it maybe begins. And then framing, right? And reframing. How do we ask the question? How do we set this up so that we can then come up with new ideas if we're stuck? And we're assuming that's why we're here, right? If we were just executing along, we wouldn't need design thinking. We would just be out there doing the thing. So we're stuck. And so that means we need to think about how do we voice the problem? How do we set it up? What's the language we use? What is the space into which we want to ideate?
And so you can look at someone's framing of the problem for their career, and you say that's not quite a productive way of saying it. Is that right?
Yeah. Or maybe the question is why? Why do you want to do that? Tell me more about what it is about that appeals to you. And then you start unearthing maybe some deeper needs or some deeper curiosities that the person has. And then you can ask around those things as opposed to one particular solution. Now we can broaden the things that might be available. And so that framing and reframing process is critical mindset. Reframing is both a tool and a way of thinking. Can we look at this from a different perspective? And I think that's very powerful.
Cool.
The idea of bias to action. Can we try something out?
Yeah.
Like, it's all very well and good to think about it, right? I mean, you had I've been thinking about being a novelist for a long time. And then you started trying it out. I'm going to write some more.
Took a year off.
Your experience was?
It took a year off to write, and I hated it.
Yeah. So you had that experience, the felt experience of, I've tried this thing now, and now I have data that I didn't have before.
Yeah.
And so,
makes sense.
Yeah.
And so talking about prototyping and then testing. So I think it might not be intuitive to someone who's listening to this, who might be a designer and understand prototyping really well, but how can you prototype a career?
Yeah. Right. How can you? It's a great question. So we talk about two kinds of prototypes, and we talk about life design prototyping. And the first one is prototype conversations. There's somebody out there doing the thing you want to do. Bill likes to use a quote from science fiction author William Gibson, which is, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. Meaning someone out there is living your future right now. They're doing the thing. So the first level of prototyping is just go talk to that person and hear their story.
Right.
And if their description of their day-to-day life and the problems and challenges that they're facing and the things that they're excited about resonates with you, and you feel excited, wow, I want to work on those problems and challenges. I want to, do that thing. That's good data. Or if your reaction is, dang, I thought it was going to be this great story, and when you talk about it, it sounds terrible. Even though you're excited about it, I don't know that I want to do that. That's also data. That's the recognition that, I don't know. And if you talk to 5 or 6 people in the field, now you've got a bunch of perspectives. And if 5 out of 6, it all sounded terrible, right? Then that's information that you didn't have before. For sure. And it's cheap, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I used to say you just takes 5 cups of coffee or 6 cups of coffee, right? You go to the Starbucks or the local coffee shop and you buy them a cup of coffee and you hear their story. And what did that cost you? That cost you $30, right? And some time and
better
some
than 30
kindness from
years.
others. Right, exactly. Rather than however many years. So start there, I'd say. And then if you're feeling like after those conversations, hey, there's there. I think I'm interested in being an novelist, or then how do you try it in a small way to sort of get a taste, right? So for you, that's like, all right, I'm gonna sit down and start writing some short stories, or I'm gonna start writing a novel. And I'm gonna do that for a couple weeks or a couple months or a couple years, right? And I'm gonna set some tripwires for myself of times to evaluate and notice, hey, how's that going? Right? And 3 years is that's a pretty big prototype. Like you went all in there.
Yeah.
Right. But you may have had some data even after the first few days and had some noticings. And maybe it's even as small as, hey, just write a blog post, just see what it's like to put writing into the world and then get back a slew of comments, some of which are positive and some of which are negative.
Yeah.
Right. How does it feel to write for the public? Or what does it even mean to write? I'm just going to write radio jingles for a day, just to see. I mean, there are all these different ways that you could try on in a 24-hour period, really spending no money.
Yeah.
That could give you some kind of data if you're willing to frame it that way. So,
for sure.
prototype experiences, great ways to check in on things.
When we do sprints, we often talk about prototyping as lowering the risk to failure.
Yes.
Right? It's so if I were applying this concept to my own life back in the day, I would say, hey, you know what? Don't quit your job and try to spend a year writing. Take a week vacation and try to spend a week writing. But really write, like try to write 2 chapters or try to write. And I think I would have probably, or had I been mindful doing that, I could have probably learned the same lessons that I learned over a much longer period of time, with much more cost. So lowering the risk of failure is interesting here. And then I guess the other thing with the prototype is that it doesn't have to be perfect, right? The goal is not to achieve certainty; it's to improve your intuition or your sense of how it's going to be.
Exactly. It's to learn. So in fact, a prototype that doesn't work, right, the week of writing where you hated it is just as good a bunch of information as a prototype that succeeded. Because what it does is give you data to make the next decision. Yeah. And so prototypes have embedded in them an implicit question. Do I like writing? Do I like writing by myself? Do I, just all of those implicit questions are surfaced. And I think that's one of the keys of a good prototype, is to really recognize it's an opportunity to learn and to ask yourself, what am I trying to learn by doing this? Am I trying to learn whether I like writing by myself or writing with another person? Like if that's the case, then maybe I would try a week writing alone and a week collaborating, right? And see kind of how those felt. If the question was, do I have good enough ideas to write about? Maybe just the writing alone and realizing, dang, I don't have anything to say, right? That would be an interesting. Or do I like writing fiction or nonfiction? That might have been a question that has come since you now write, and you write about other things that are more about what you do.
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah.
It's super interesting. And one of the things that I and maybe we'll get to this, but when I was running a kind of a life design sprint with myself, one of the most useful things I did was I identified, I think it was 5 or 6 people that I was really kind of jealous of, their career. And I just read their Wikipedia article, start to finish, about their whole life and how they got to what they're doing today. And I started immediately seeing patterns. One of them is most of them had a podcast, which is what led to starting a podcast. They had a way to communicate their ideas, which I think I'm kind of something that I secretly wanted. So it's really, really interesting. So, and
that connects back to your storytelling and to your novel writing too. the communication of ideas. How do I share the things that I'm thinking about or the stories I want to tell with the world?
Yeah, I agree. It didn't have to be in story form. It could be in a more direct form. One question that I have is you seem to be also focusing a lot on workshops for women with the life design.
That's right.
So is there any difference between or any special reason to kind of do a special course for women or special workshop for women besides the obvious distractions that happen when you mix people? Is there a difference in the way you approach it?
Yeah, there is actually. It's mostly in context. So the tools are the same, but the conversations about the tools are different. And I think this would be the case with any affinity group. If you got together folks from a similar cultural background, or an LGBT workshop, or the felt experience of how we design our lives is informed by our identity. And there are constraints and assumptions that the world places on people based on that identity. And women have particular assumptions and constraints that have been placed upon them by the cultures in which they live. So if you look at the expectations around caregiving, for example, the assumption is often, oh, well, the woman will stay home and take care of the kids. Oh, the daughter will take care of the aging parents. There are assumptions about behavior. Women are supposed to be nice. That woman who's really ambitious, we have words for her. Men, on the other hand, have expectations around, well, maybe you should be the provider. Maybe you should be aggressive. Maybe it's okay if you're angry, but it's not if I am. So there are these different expectations based on who we are. And so the conversations that we were having with women in co-ed workshops were just different. Susan and I were noticing we were in some corporate settings and we were having conversations on the side with women who wanted to talk about some difficult things to talk about in a co-ed work environment. And we realized we need a space to have those conversations, a space where perhaps the experiences aren't all the same, but there is at least an understanding of the water in which we're swimming from the perspective of being a woman in that space. And how do we then talk about our life design, given that those realities are true, and design around them or design with them, or figure out what does that mean to us? What kinds of narratives have we internalized? Do we want to keep those? Do we want to discard them? And that conversation happens very organically when no one has to explain, no, really, it's a thing. Which, unfortunately, when people have very disparate backgrounds, sometimes we want to say, no, that isn't really your experience because my experience was different. And unfortunately, at least in our society, men have long felt that they have the podium to tell us how it is. And so in the absence of that voice, then some of the other voices can really rise and be heard. And I think that was the impetus. Quite frankly, the real impetus of Susan and I starting the Designing Your Life for Women workshops was the election in 2016. We had done a pilot with friends and family. It had been pretty successful, but we weren't sure we really wanted to operationalize and build a business around it. And then, unfortunately, the election was very shocking to both she and I. And the realization that we were in a society where openly misogynist behavior was not only not punished, but was in a way kind of swept under the rug or even just sort of laughed off, made us realize, wait, we really do want to operate in this space and really start thinking about how we can create opportunities to talk about what it's like to design your life in the world that we're living in right now.
That makes a lot of sense to me, because I think there's these conversations are happening a lot around different groups, but with the idea of privilege, there's certain problems that you just don't have, and so you're not very eager to talk about them because you don't have them. And I think I can definitely see why different social expectations, men have more of a permission to be selfish and more of a permission to say, well, what's good for me right now in terms of my career. There's no, I don't know many men who struggled with that piece of it, right? Like, so it's interesting, and that makes a lot of sense. So thank you for that answer. And hopefully you're feeling a lot of satisfaction from the way it's turning out now, because it seems to be.
Yeah, it's been going very well. And I would say as I mentioned before, the opportunities available now with COVID and the constraints have really upended what we were doing. We were really focused on these in-person events, and the opportunity now is to move into the digital space. And so we are about to have our first month-long Designing Your Life journey for women. And we've built a Designing Your Life app that will support ongoing reflection over the course of that month to inform the conversations we have when we have synchronous meetings. So wow. I'm really excited about that. We've done lots of virtual in terms of synchronous meetings and Zooms and things like that. And this will be the first time that we've rolled out publicly this app. I have no idea what's going to happen. I think it's going to be great. And I also don't know, a daily commitment to do something, to think about what you believe, what you are doing about your life, about your work, about past roles, all of those things take a little bit of time and space, and carving that out for a weekend, which is what we've done in the past, it's kind of nicely contained. If we are now asking you to do it daily, that means you have to carve out a little bit of time each day amidst all of the other pressures and constraints of your life. And so I'll be really curious to see how that feels to folks, because consistency over time is something that's hard for humans, and life right now is very chaotic. And so I'm hoping that it will be a moment to sit down and reflect and take a little space. And it may also be that it's just tough to do. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I can see it being an anchor that people really gravitate towards, and it helps them actually create some order in their lives, or that they struggle with it. It could be that different people have different experiences.
Right.
I've had an month-long online meditation retreat many years ago that had like a daily commitment to sit, and then a couple of meetings. It wasn't every day, but it was a couple of times a week, a few times a week. But you also came with a daily commitment to sit and meditate for every day for at least 30 minutes. And that was it was very nicely wrapped. It felt like that month kind of stands out as the month I did that. Even though it was just Google Meet, and I think there's an opportunity there. I good luck with it. I'd love to hear how it goes, and definitely if you want to give us the dates, then we'll
absolutely. It starts September 26th. Nice. It ends October 24th, the month. And then we'll have a follow-up meeting a month later to sort of check in again on how it's doing. Cool. And you can find it on Eventbrite. It's Designing Your Life for Women. So you can take a look.
Awesome.
1 month virtual journey. It is an answer in some ways. We were talking about the opportunities and how chat has allowed people to be heard. I think it's an answer in some ways to the fact that sometimes people need more time to let material sink in. And what I love about this format is if you want to spend more time thinking about your Odyssey plans and the ideas for your multiple futures, or you really want to sit and write and rewrite your work view or your life view, it gives you the space to do that. And it allows people to process at whatever speed they'd like to process. And in a weekend of packed and we have 8 minutes, okay, go. Okay, now we're done. Now we're having a conversation. For some, that is energizing.
Yeah.
And for others, it's exhausting. And I think this will just allow a little more space. So I'm actually I'm optimistic that for those who can fit it into their daily routine, that it will actually be really fulfilling, and perhaps even more so than a more intense and short-term experience.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think Seth Godin is famous for doing these longer workshops that are really integrated into your life. I'm actually thinking about taking one of them because they seem really interesting. But yeah, cool. So I that sounds like it has a really good chance of being more impactful than something very short and over a weekend, and then you're thrown back into your life and return back to your old patterns. Here you actually have a chance to bake that in. Super interesting. So I guess I want to ask you one final kind of open-ended question about where is this all going? How do you see with the design, with design thinking in general and with life design in particular, what does the future hold? Is this on the rise? Are more people accepting it? And are there any exciting developments that are going to happen with this? Anything that you kind of can project forward? What would you like to see?
What I'd like to see is everyone having access to tools that help them navigate ambiguity. And everyone having communities in which they can have these kinds of conversations if they want them. And that sounds really ambitious, right? The world should have these tools. But I actually think navigating ambiguity is really scary. This is a time right now where ambiguity is absolutely pummeling us from all sides. Here in California, we've got the pandemic, we have the fires. We are wrestling as a society right now with history of oppression of large numbers of people and in fact, just human cruelty. So, and worldwide, we're seeing acts of human cruelty every day. People are divided and afraid and navigating conditions that often are outside their control. And so the processes that we're talking about are potentially I'm not suggesting that life design is going to change the world, but I think it can change an individual's experience of the world in a positive way. And so I really believe that the goal is to try to share this with as many people as are interested in it, and to help people just face ambiguity with greater resilience and greater confidence, that though they don't know what to do, they have a process by which to start. And I think, it sounds quite ambitious, but that's what I envision. I envision a way to share this with anybody who wants it.
I love that. That's so close to where I would like to contribute, is giving tools to people to handle these situations in their lives. I think that's part of our mission at Remake is to think about how to bring this to more people. So thanks for that. And since you kind of brought up the individual making a difference in individual people's lives, I wanted to see if there's any story that comes to mind or any example that's a little bit more concrete about how these tools really open up possibilities, like maybe a story of an individual you don't have to name or something, something that will make this real for people.
I have actually a really good story, and maybe this will be a chance to share the story of a woman who came to a Designing Your Life for Women retreat about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. So one of the things that she had been for a long time thinking about was how to have impact in her community. She cares deeply about the area in which she lives. She lives in Carlsbad County in Southern California, and was really feeling the need to serve her community better. And in her 3 Odyssey plans, one of them was included running for office. And when she shared those plans with her colleagues at the retreat, she was lit up. She was excited. She cared deeply about the work she was doing, and she was She was fired up, and they noticed that, and they reflected that back to her. And afterward, we debriefed the whole experience, and she said, yes, the other women in my triad, they mentioned that I was really fired up about this. And we asked her, what's stopping you? And she said, well, frankly, the fundraising aspect. I have lots of ideas about policy. I really believe that our community can be well served by doing some particular things. But the idea of raising money for a campaign feels very daunting. Mm. And in that moment, another woman got up and handed her $5 and said, let me be the first to contribute to your campaign. Wow. And so Lena Panagaitis is now running for office in Carlsbad County. Wow. And there was this moment where she realized that she could do this. And she's now doing it. Wow. And I think that's the power of radical collaboration and the process of unearthing where you're fired up, where you want to serve your community, and then having people around you affirm you in doing those things. And so I don't know what will happen in November, but I do know that she's going for it, and that she has ideas about how to serve her community that she's excited to enact. And that was the moment where she started down that path. Wow. Who knows where that path will take her? My fingers are crossed. I've donated to her campaign. But it is in those moments where all of a sudden we feel like something is available to us that wasn't available before that I think magic happens.
Wow. And in the space that you created, that where people have the opportunity of supporting one another, and sometimes that's all someone needs is just, I believe in you, go and do it. Mm-hmm. You're not alone. It's an amazing story. So let's end here, and I'll just ask, because this is a great place to end, but I'll just ask, where can people find you? Where should they go if they want to find out more?
Absolutely. So you can find things about the public workshops, designingyou.life. And if you're interested in women's workshops in particular, you can go /women, but there's lots of other stuff there about our co-ed work and also corporate work and facilitating and coaching and all of those things. So please find us there, designingyou.life. And if you're interested in the work that we do at Stanford, the Stanford Life Design Lab is where we're doing that kind of work. So if you're an educator and you're thinking about using this in your school, please find us there, Stanford Life Design Lab. There are trainings that we run specifically for educators out of the Stanford Lab, and we'd love to have you join the life design community and to use these tools with your students.
Awesome. And all of these links will be in the show notes. Thank you so much, Kathy. I really enjoyed our conversation.
My pleasure.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.